All right, let's take a look at poetry and drama. Yep. So here's a few questions for us to look at that we will address in this video. And then we'll look at these questions again at the end of the video and see if you can answer them. Give an example of an iambic word. What types of poetry don't rhyme? How many lines does a sonnet have? What type of theme tends to show up in an epic poem? Okay, so that's not necessarily, I don't think, intuitive knowledge for most of us. So unless you really spend a ton of time in poetry and already know all this stuff, there's some things we're gonna have to commit to our memory so that we can answer the poetry and drama questions correctly. So we'll start off with meter and verse. So when a pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables is regular, it's called a meter. When meter is used in composition, it's called a verse. Okay, and then we jump into iambic meter, which was one of our questions, right? An iambic meter is an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. Words like belong and predict are iambic. Okay, so it's unstressed followed by stressed. And remember that was one of our questions, right? Very first question up there, that first bullet point. Give an example of an iambic word. Okay, and then we have belong and predict as a couple of really good examples. Not all poetry has to rhyme. Free verse does not use a set rhythm. However, it is a requirement that all poetry be written in verse. Okay, so we'll look at free verse and blank verse. Free verse lacks a regular pattern, does not rhyme. A well-known example of free verse is Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, and that could easily be a reference on the test. It's very common. Blank verse is also unrhymed, but it consists of lines of iambic pentameter, with pentameter meaning 5 sets of unstressed syllables followed by stressed syllables. Well-known examples of blank verse include William Shakespeare sonnets. Okay, that leads to the obvious question, what's a sonnet? In poetry, a sonnet has 14 lines and is written in iambic pentameter. Okay, so that was another one of our questions, was it not? How many lines does a sonnet have? Okay, so that's just one you need to commit to your memory. Sonnet has 14 lines. This question, and I think like a pretty good chance that would be the end of the question, just how many lines, and then they'd give you 4 different answer choices. But if you know that it's written in iambic pentameter, that's even better. Each line of a sonnet has 10 syllables. This means that iambic pentameter is a type of writing, while sonnet is the actual type of poetry. Okay, and we jump into ballads. Ballads are often narratives set to music. Ballads derive from the medieval French, which were originally dance songs, right? So that's where ballads comes from. I would really think I'd be very surprised that the fact that it was French dance songs, as far as like derivation, I would doubt that would matter for ballads, but knowing that it's narrative set to music is important. Okay, then looking at syllables. So a dactyl is 1 syllable stressed followed by 2 unstressed syllables. Anapest is 2 unstressed syllables followed by a stressed syllable. And troch is 1 stressed syllable followed by an unstressed syllable. So again, probably something you just have to commit to memory. So we look at narrative poetry. It's a form of poetry that tells a story, often making use of the voices of a narrator and characters as well. The entire story is usually written in metered verse. Narrative poems do not have to follow rhythmic patterns. They can either be short or long, and they can be simple or complex. Watching a stage version of a text alleviates the difficulty of decoding and allows the student to understand the story by viewing and relying on their auditory skills. The main plot is reinforced through the stage version. In many cases, comprehension is increased when the child returns to the text. And then let's look at a few actual types of poetry. Haiku is a traditional form of Japanese poetry. Haiku poems consist of 3 lines. The first and last lines of a haiku have 5 syllables, and the middle line has 7 syllables. The lines rarely rhyme, so if we're thinking of poems that don't rhyme, haiku would be one for sure. An ode is an elaborately structured poem praising or glorifying an event or individual. An epic poem is a long narrative poem that is usually about heroic deeds and events that are significant to the culture of the poet. Many ancient writers used epic poetry to tell tales of intense adventures and heroic feats. So, again, what we have on the screen here, epic poem, intense adventures, and heroic feats. If you know that about epic poem, you're good. And then finally, a canto is a division of a long poem. Okay. And then we jump back to the questions that we started with. And so we've got 4 of them here. And really the best thing to do at this point, pause the video, see if you can answer these questions. If you can't, scroll back, get back into the video where we talk about it so that you know the answer and that you're ready to go for poetry and drama.